These here are collard greens. I'm about to school y'all. Collard greens are the oldest member of the cabbage family. They originated in Greece where they were domesticated 3,000 years ago. All members of the brassica family spread from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic shores of Spain, France, and England. English and Spanish settlers brought the seed to America in the 15 to 1600s, but it was a minor crop in the colonial garden. West Africans cooked a variety of greens. Among them were cassava, or tapioca leaves, coquillon leaves, also called taro leaves, amaranthus leaves, moringa, bitter leaf, water leaf, fluted pumpkin, soko leaves, jute leaf, ukazi leaf, uziza leaf, atalon leaf, scent leaf, utazi leaf, oha leaf, potato leaf, and sarsar leaves. That's a lot of variety. Enslaved Africans found few wild greens in the South and came to rely on collards. Slaves adopted collards and made them a central part of their diet. It wasn't just because it was the only vegetable they were allowed to have. I think that's a myth. Collards continue to produce leaves throughout the growing season, and they can be harvested for months. Collards helped all Southerners survive due to their productivity. We had access to other greens, but they were also seasonally available. One of them was poke. Pokeweed is available from March through frost, so it's a reliable plant for greens. Summer squash leaves are available in the summer, and winter squash leaves and pumpkin are available in the winter. They might also have cooked lamb's quarters and dock leaves. Now I'm going to teach y'all how to cook collards, and it's an African cooking technique that the slaves brought over here with them. Fresh collards are always the best to cook with, but if you can't get them fresh, you might be able to find them frozen or canned. They do wilt in heat, so you want to keep them at around 50 degrees. The first thing you want to do with your collards before you cook with them is rinse the sand off of them. They're grown in sandy soil, and if there's any wind flying around while they're growing, they're going to get sand in their leaves. So you want to rinse them. And you do want to rinse them in cold water. That's essential. Keep these things cool until you're ready to cook with them. You don't want wilted greens. You know, I forgot to mention we have other greens in the spring too. We got turnip greens, radish greens, dandelion greens, mustard greens. If you're growing it, you might have black cabbage from Italy and kale. Yeah, there's lots of greens to choose from, not just lettuce and spinach. Now, the next thing you want to do is strip the leaves off these stems. Now, you have to do is grab hold of them and pull the leaf off. You'll be left with a stem in one hand and a leaf in the other. And just put that leaf on your board. This will go by real quick. When they come off like this, it's perfectly fine. Just fold them up, lay them down. No big deal. You know, there's a lot of mess about slavery. It ain't just the food they ate or the way they were treated. Now, I'll admit, they were treated very badly. I'll get to that in a minute. But from everything I've read, the brutality didn't happen till after 1840. There were a lot of suicides and infanticides among the female slaves. They would actually murder their own children to prevent them from being sold off. They would commit suicide to prevent themselves from being sold off to another plantation owner. That tells me they didn't want to leave the place where they were. they didn't want to leave their families. Maybe they just didn't want to go to another plantation. Maybe they might have actually enjoyed being at that plantation, but for some reason or other, the planter decided he needed money to pay a mortgage and picked out the most troublesome slave of the bunch and wanted to sell her off. And, you know, they'd take babies off the breast and sell them. There's actually an account of, I think it happened on a ship or on an entry port. A woman with a baby were on the auction block, and the slaver took the baby off the woman's breast and sold it, and the woman jumped into the water and drowned, just committed suicide. There's a list of documented slaves on Wikipedia, and it includes like every documented slave in history, not just slaves of the American South. It's all of them. And I was reading through it and read about a slave named Anise who had murdered 5 children, and at least 2 of them were known to be hers. And she was hanged. I think she was the first woman hanged in Missouri. Might have been the first female slave hanged in Missouri. I don't know. I'd have to go back and read it. But I'm not content with ignorance. I read a lot. I question Hollywood narratives. I question some of the things in the movies that they don't add up to historic accounts. I don't believe it. It's a myth that slaves weren't allowed to make money. A lot of them made money if a woman was particularly good at sewing, or if you had a fiddle player, a good blacksmith. Yeah, those slaves were like gold, and they were well cared for. If they behaved well, if they just did their work and didn't cause any trouble, they were highly prized. And they were allowed to make money, and that's how they bought their freedom and the freedom of their families. And when they did that, they weren't just buying their freedom from the plantation master. When they bought their freedom, they were actually paying off the mortgage. They could have been paying off their own mortgage, or they could have been paying off the mortgage for the land or the crops, the seeds. They were allowed to own land. There are quite a few black towns throughout the South, so there was nothing stopping a black man from purchasing land. He just couldn't vote. Not for a while, anyway. Black men could own other black slaves. There was a law in Virginia that a black man could not own a white man, because there for a while, John Punch owned not only John Castor, but he also owned 2 white slaves. And there were Native Americans who had white slaves. So I think the state of Virginia passed a law against it, or the Commonwealth of Virginia. Lashing was a common punishment that was given to everyone during this time. It wasn't just for blacks. White people got lashed too. There are documented cases of white people being lashed for stealing. There's a whipping tree in front of the courthouse in Seminole, Oklahoma, where if a judge issued a sentence of 10 lashes, 20 lashes, 50 lashes for whatever the crime was, they'd get tied to that tree or chained to it and whipped. Historically, they would have been whipped with a cat o' nine tails. I think being whipped with a bullwhip was something that was invented by Hollywood. I don't know that it occurred in the South. I do know that the Spanish used bullwhips on their slaves. The Spanish were cruel. But I don't know if the Scots or the Irish or the English ever, or the French even, ever used a bullwhip. Interesting thing about the French, especially in Haiti, they had a practice called plissage, where a Frenchman was allowed to have a mulatto or a quadroon or an octoroon mistress, but was prohibited from marrying her. He could take care of her, he could have children with her, but marriage was prohibited. And a lot of these quadroons and octoroons had dark African slaves of their own. And when the slave owners and the slaves fled Haiti during the Haitian Revolt, they fled to Louisiana. They continued to practice plissage. And that's why there are so many mixed people in Louisiana, particularly around New Orleans. It's very common. And they don't care down there. Why should they? It's part of their culture. So let them have it. Why pick on them for it? Why give them a hard time because they speak Cajun French and mixed races? I'll tell you why it was such a big deal. Because of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. A white Congress gave a black doctor money to perform a really sick experiment on his own people, who during the 1920s would have been freed slaves. And heaven help them, they didn't know any better. This black doctor told these field hands that he was going to give them a vaccine against the flu or something, or told them he was going to give them a vaccine against syphilis. Because apparently there might have been an epidemic of it, I think. And they all lined up and took a shot. And it made him sick. He gave them syphilis intentionally so that he could study the effects of syphilis on the African American population in the American South, particularly in Tuskegee, Alabama. Well, guess what happened? Remember what happened during COVID? People were ordered to stay home and self-isolate, and you couldn't touch anything. Everything had to be sanitized. That reminded me of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And the syphilis experiment was the whole reason for banning travel among African Americans. It was the reason they had to perform last on the Chitlin circuit, because the stage and everything they touched had to be sanitized after they left the stage. No white person was going to take a stage after a black person because it hadn't been sanitized yet. They were afraid they were going to get syphilis. They had to have separate watering fountains and separate toilets because of syphilis. A black man was not allowed to touch a white woman because of syphilis. They weren't allowed to marry because of syphilis. In 1924, the state of Virginia passed a law that was called the one-drop rule. And that meant if you even had a drop of Negro blood in you, you were considered black. You couldn't be white. And that was because of the fear of syphilis. And if you were categorized as black, no white man would touch you if you were a woman. Hell, maybe if you were even a man. I don't, to each their own. The Eastern Star chapter of the Masonic Lodge was established because women wanted the right to vote, and the men were like, well, okay, we'll make you Masonically obligated to vote the way your men want you to vote. When Margaret Sanger was arguing in favor of abortion, she approached the Eastern Stars and told them that, now this is the sales pitch she gave them to get these women to go along with it. She told them that black babies would be aborted. See, they were trying to force black women to abort their babies because of this fear of syphilis, because they were afraid black babies were going to be born with syphilis, and there was going to be a real syphilis epidemic. So even into the 1970s, after Roe v. Wade, white people would call up these abortion clinics and offer donations to these clinics if they would pledge to abort black babies. And that was also part of the affirmative action movement. They didn't want their white kids competing with blacks in the workforce, because with affirmative action, it made it hard for white people to get a job because they couldn't compete with blacks, because blacks were willing to work for less money. That was the whole reason why the South fought to preserve slavery, i.e. their way of life, is because it was cheaper to own a slave than it was to pay a white person to work. You couldn't force a white person to work, but you could force a black person to work. We can't force blacks to work anymore, but we can force illegal immigrants to work. What can I say? We need cheap labor in this country. We're always going to need it. I can't afford to pay a white person to do anything for me anymore. Not with inflation. The only way I could afford to pay a white person to work for me now is if I hire a meth addict. And that ain't going to happen. So you see what it's done? Inflation never helps anybody. We had the best economy ever in the 1990s. It was great. You could make $1,200 a month and live really well on that money. But now, if you really think about what gave rise to the Tulsa race riot / massacre, it was that fear of syphilis. The report stated that a black boy touched a white girl in an elevator and all hell broke loose, and that was what kicked it off. It caused a lot of riots, actually. Look up the Chicago race riot. What was it? The Red Summer of 1919. Yeah, y'all need to look that shit up. The Russian Bolsheviks started that. Right before the end of World War I, the Russian Bolsheviks started the International Workers of the World Labor Union. And they recruited black men from the South to move to Chicago, Detroit, New York City to go to work in the factories, and they offered them housing. So all of these, what they call the projects in these big inner cities, is a result of Bolshevik socialism. And when white men came back from fighting in World War I, they found that all of their factory jobs had been taken by blacks. And that is what kicked off the Red Summer of 1919. And it was also right after the viewing of The Birth of a Nation, which was, I think, might have been the very first silent film ever premiered. The Birth of a Nation was based on a book, and it lit a firestorm in people, because there was something in that book about a black boy touching a white girl, or blacks were trying to take over, or something. I don't know. It was a real fear-mongering type of film. And the author later stated that he regretted ever writing the book, because that's when the lynching started. And he didn't mean for that to happen. So anyway, back to the cruelty. And this topic is something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. Now, I'm tired of white people being forced into silence about the South and slavery and our perception of it, or our ancestors' perception. All of the beatings that happened don't make good sense, because those slaves were mortgaged. And why would a plantation master beat a slave to the point they can't work? I mean, that just makes them unproductive. Why would they do that? It doesn't make any sense. So, I don't think the beatings were as severe as Hollywood makes us believe. And I don't believe it was that bad at every plantation. I don't think it was all that widespread. Now, these beatings might have happened while the plantation master was gone. It might have been the overseers who beat the slaves. We know that rapes were common because it was a way for a plantation master to own his slaves outright. And he could do whatever he wanted to with property that he owned. He could sell that property. So the babies that were born on the plantation, they were his outright, and he could sell them to pay the mortgage on the other slaves and on the property and the house and the crops. I ain't saying it's right. It was a really horrible and cruel thing to do. But I will say that all of the accounts that I've read occurred after 1840. And the severe beatings occurred after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. And it was the New York banks who owned the slaves who really pushed for the Fugitive Slave Act, because if a slave ran away and couldn't be found, it meant the bank lost money. And the planter still had to pay off that mortgage. He still had to pay for that slave that ran away. So a runaway slave would have cost the planter money. It would have cost the bank money. You can't file an insurance claim on a runaway slave. I mean, if they're dead or dismembered, or they lose an eye or a finger or whatever, you can't file a claim on that if they're missing. And so that's the reason they started beating their slaves so severely. It was to teach them not to run away. That was the consequence for running away. It was a whipping. And like I've said before, they were whipped with a cat o' nine tails, not a bullwhip. Not to my knowledge. The man they call Whipped Peter, his proper name is Gordon. It was the New York newspapers who called him Whipped Peter because they didn't have enough respect for the man to learn his proper name, which I think is really sad. He was beaten in Haiti, probably with a bullwhip. And he was discovered in 1850 by a journalist who took a photograph or tintype of the keloid scars on his back. He was said to have had a tree on his back. And if you've ever seen the movie Beloved with Oprah Winfrey, she was said to have had a tree on her back. And she had fake keloid scars on her back because she had been beaten so severely with a bullwhip. That portrayal is based on Gordon, aka Whipped Peter. I seriously doubt that every slave on every plantation from 1619 to after 1865 was whipped so severely they had keloid scars on their back. I don't believe it. It doesn't make good sense. Slaves not being allowed to read or write. That's not entirely true. There were some plantation masters who sent their own mulatto children to school in Ohio. That was called up north back then. They were allowed to learn to read and write and get an education at that school, and some of them wrote memoirs of their time as a slave. Some of them returned to the South and established all-black schools for black children. I think one returned and became a nurse. The horrible treatment wasn't universal. It didn't apply in every case, and it didn't apply to every slave. And Hollywood movies and educators today are doing everyone a disservice by telling people that every slave was treated badly. Plantation owners had a duty and an obligation to take care of their slaves because they couldn't survive without them. They were fed, nurtured when they were sick. If they were injured in the field, they got doctored. And when they died, they were buried on the plantation. They might have been buried in an unmarked location away from the white people, but they were obligated to be buried on the plantation. It wasn't like they had a cemetery in town. Where else were they going to be buried? They could have just thrown them in the Mississippi River or threw them in the swamps or took them out to a port and dumped them in the ocean. They could have done that because they were property. But they didn't. They buried them. You know, while I'm on the subject, I will say that arriving to America in chains and being kept in a pen the size of a dog crate until you were sold off, or if you were being punished, you know, it was that was really cruel. But I don't think we owe their descendants anything because of the sins of the past. I think blacks today, especially the Black Lives Matter group that is arguing in favor of reparations, I think they're jealous because Native Americans get BIA money, they get car tags, they get housing, they get jobs at casinos, and they get oil royalties, mineral right royalties off their allotment land. And, they think it's because white people tried to annihilate Native Americans. Not all tribes get those benefits, and not every person in every tribe gets the benefit. And the reason some do get those benefits is because the tribe made a treaty with the United States. There are tribes out there that aren't federally recognized, and they don't get any money just because they're Indian. I'm going to show y'all how to cut up these collard greens. After they've had the stalk and the vein stripped out of them, they're going to naturally fold in half. So you lay it down, stem side away from you. And if you have some like this one that still have a hard vein down the center, just squeeze the leaf and pull that out, because this is going to be tough and you don't want to eat that. Sometimes you miss a few, it's okay. I try to stack them with the largest leaf on the bottom and the smallest leaf on the top. Now you take a hold of them like this and then roll them towards you. And you roll them up like a tight cigar. And now you cut them into ribbons. You do this the way you cut basil. This is called a chiffonade cut. There, that's it. Now, you want to put them in a bowl, pot, whatever. I've got this tub sitting next to me on top of my trash can. When you're done with a mess of greens, they're going to look like this. I need to boil some water to put these greens in. I've got some ham soup base here, and I'm going to add some to this liquid. I'm adding 4 tablespoons to this pot. I'm going to add another 4 teaspoons to this pot because I want a strong ham flavor. I want these greens well seasoned. Okay, now that this water is hot, I'm going to put in a little bit of greens at a time and let them wilt down. They're going to cook like spinach. Now I need to cut up these turnips. Turnips are another winter crop in the South. If you're Irish and you're eating this dish on New Year's, the turnips and the collard greens represent silver coins. The collard greens represent paper money, and I'm going to put some corn dodgers in my collard greens, and those corn dodgers represent gold coins. I'll cut these turnips into 1/2 inch die-sized pieces. After the greens have wilted, I'm going to put my turnips in. Now I'm going to put in the meat from the ham hocks. This ham hock didn't produce nearly enough meat to season these greens, so I have cut up 1/3 of a slab of bacon and I've separated the meat from the fat. I'm going to put the meat in the greens and then I'm going to render the fat. I'm going to add some more water to it and I'm going to put it on a slow boil. I ended up putting another 4 teaspoons of ham broth base in this pot after I put the greens in it. Now I'm going to dish out some of these greens. This juice is what we call pot liquor. It's not Liquor, it's Likker. Liquor. And it is delicious. That pot liquor is what we like to sop up with cornbread. Okay, right here's my corn dodgers. And this is my collard greens with ham and turnips. And this is one of my favorite Southern dishes. I realized when I made these collard greens that the ham broth way back in the day would have been made with roasted pork neck bones, tailbones, leg bones, you name it. Because I boiled 3 ham hocks and didn't get any broth at all. I got plenty of gelatin. I got a lot of damn gelatin, but no broth at all. So I had to make this juice with ham broth, and it took 12 teaspoons of it to get it to taste right. These are good. I don't know why we ever stopped making them. They're delicious. And they are most definitely the predecessor to a hush puppy. And they're the predecessor to iron skillet cooked cornbread. Dunk it in my pot liquor and see what it tastes like. Tastes good. Now I know why people come up with the idea of crumbling southern cornbread into their beans. That's why people in Oklahoma and Texas eat pinto beans. That comes from the South. Me personally, I can't do it because I've got texture issues. This must be the Southern idea of soup and crackers. I'm going to sit here and finish my collard greens and Dodgers. Bye, y'all.